Terrace wasn't impressed. Not by the towering gates, not by the shimmering force fields, and certainly not by the self-satisfied smirk of the guard that led him inside. He'd seen worse, dealt with worse, and escaped from worse. But this place, they called it Miros Detention Complex, a high-security prison said to be the epitome of alien engineering. To the galactic community, it was a fortress. To him, it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. The guard, a hulking beast with 4 arms and iridescent scales, barked orders in a guttural language, motioning for Terrace to step into the scanner. He complied, hands raised lazily, as the machine hummed and whirred around him. Biosignature checks, electromagnetic interference tests, and something that felt suspiciously like a mild electric shock pulsed through his body. "Clear," the machine chirped in its monotone voice. "Welcome to your new home, human," the guard growled, his yellow eyes gleaming with a mix of amusement and disdain. "Try not to get yourself killed. It would be boring." Terrace said nothing. His eyes wandered over the facility as they marched him further in. Rows of cells, each guarded by invisible barriers of energy, stretched endlessly in every direction. Some held prisoners, creatures of various shapes and sizes, most slumped in their cells, resigned to their fate. Others stared at him with hollow, unblinking eyes, curiosity barely registering behind their exhaustion. This is what they consider unbreakable? Terrace thought to himself, suppressing a smirk. The guard might as well have handed him a challenge on a silver platter. He wasn't just here to serve time, he was here to escape. As they reached his cell, the force field flickered, allowing him to step inside. The energy buzzed behind him, trapping him in what was supposed to be an inescapable room. The guard paused, arms folded across his chest, expecting some reaction, perhaps fear or panic. Terrace simply sat down on the edge of the cot, his eyes still scanning the room. No cameras, no obvious sensors. They relied on their technology too much. They thought it was perfect. They were wrong. "What's the matter, human? Got nothing to say?" the guard prodded. "Just wondering how long it'll take me to get out of here," Terrace finally said, his voice calm, almost casual. The guard snorted, a deep rumbling sound. "We've had all kinds in here, species that could bend light, control gravity, even read minds. None of them escaped. What makes you think a human will do any better?" "Because I'm not like them." Terrace leaned back, hands behind his head. "I'm a problem solver, and this place, it's just a problem." The guard shook his head, muttering something under his breath before stomping off, leaving Terrace alone with the hum of the force field. Across the hallway, a large insectoid alien in the next cell watched him with beady eyes. "You're new," it rasped in a low clicking voice. "You're also doomed." Terrace glanced over. "Doomed? How so?" The insectoid shifted, its exoskeleton scraping against the floor. "This place, no one leaves. They forget you exist, and you rot. The guards, they don't care. The system doesn't care." "That's what they want you to believe," Terrace replied. "Everyone's got a weakness, even this place." The alien clicked again, sounding almost like a chuckle. "Many have tried. All have failed. Your confidence is amusing." "Confidence? No. Experience." Terrace stood up, pacing his cell. "They built this place to trap minds that think like theirs. They weren't ready for a human." The insectoid tilted its head, mandibles twitching. "And what makes you so special?" Terrace smiled, but there was no humor in it. "You'll see." As the hours passed, Terrace observed the guards, their routines, the flickers in the energy fields when prisoners were moved or meals were delivered. Everything in the Miros complex followed a pattern, a rhythm, and he knew that once you found the rhythm, you could break it. Across the cell block, another alien, a squat reptilian creature, watched Terrace with narrowed eyes. "You talk big, human," it hissed. "But this place, it's alive. It knows." Terrace raised an eyebrow. "Alive?" The reptilian creature grinned, showing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "The walls, the floors, even the air. It senses everything. There's no escaping it." For the first time, Terrace felt a slight twinge of uncertainty. The alien's words were cryptic, but there was something unsettling about the way it said them. Still, he pushed the feeling aside. He had faced worse odds before. This was no different. By the time night fell, Terrace had already identified several weak points in the prison system. The question wasn't if he could escape, it was how long it would take. As he lay back on the cot, hands behind his head once more, his mind was already working, calculating, planning. The other prisoners could think whatever they wanted. The guards could mock him all they liked. But in the end, they'd all learn the same lesson. There's no such thing as an impossible prison. The first test came early. Terrace had spent the better part of the night observing, but now it was time to act. He stood in his cell, his eyes on the force field in front of him. Alien energy fields were tricky, designed to fry anything that tried to pass through unauthorized. But Terrace wasn't planning to pass through. He was planning to disrupt it. The morning shift began with the usual monotony. Guards patrolled lazily, barely glancing at the prisoners as they passed. In the control room, alien operators monitored the complex with an overconfidence that bordered on arrogance. This place hadn't seen a successful breakout in decades. They believed their systems were flawless. Terrace smiled at that thought. He reached into his boot, fingers grazing the small piece of metal he'd pried from the cot the night before. It was small enough to go unnoticed by the guards, but sharp enough for what he needed. He moved to the edge of the cell, eyeing the seams of the energy barrier. There was always a fluctuation in force fields, no matter how advanced they were. Tiny, nearly imperceptible shifts that could be exploited. He just needed to find the right spot. Across the hall, the insectoid alien, now more intrigued than skeptical, clicked its mandibles. "You're going to kill yourself, human." Terrace glanced over. "Not today." He carefully slid the metal shard along the edge of the field, feeling for the slight vibration that would indicate a weak point. The force field crackled slightly, but he pulled back before it could discharge. He had to be patient. Timing was everything. Minutes passed, and the insectoid kept watching, silent now. Terrace finally found it, a slight shimmer in the lower left corner, where the energy flow was weaker. He gave a small, satisfied nod. It wasn't much, but it was a start. His next move required precision. He lifted the shard, angling it just right, and slipped it into the seam. The energy field reacted immediately, sparking against the metal with a hiss. Terrace gritted his teeth, his muscles tensing as the shock ran up his arm, but he didn't let go. Instead, he twisted the shard slightly, disrupting the flow of energy just enough to cause a brief flicker. The field blinked out for less than a second, so fast that no one else would have noticed. But to Terrace, it was all the confirmation he needed. Across the hall, the insectoid stared, wide-eyed. "You did it." "Not yet," Terrace said, stepping back from the force field. His arms still tingled from the shock, but the pain was manageable. The point wasn't to escape right now. It was to understand the system. This first test had proven what he suspected. There were vulnerabilities. Small, but enough. The guards remained blissfully unaware of what had just happened. One of them, a lanky, blue-skinned creature with long arms and a bored expression, lumbered past Terrace's cell, glancing in briefly before continuing his rounds. Terrace leaned casually against the wall, hands in his pockets, as if he'd spent the last few minutes doing nothing of interest. As the guard passed, Terrace's mind was already racing with possibilities. The field could be disrupted, but it would require more than a makeshift tool to break out completely. He needed leverage, something more sophisticated, but not obvious enough to draw attention. The next few days were spent testing the routine. He learned when the force fields powered down for maintenance, how the guards rotated their shifts, and the exact timing of the automated drones that patrolled the corridors. Each piece of information was logged in his mind, part of the growing blueprint for his escape. But the most important discovery came unexpectedly. It was during mealtime when the reptilian alien from the neighboring cell shuffled closer. It had been watching Terrace for days, suspicious but curious. "You think you're smart, human," it hissed in a low voice, barely audible over the clatter of trays and the idle chatter of prisoners. "I think I'm practical," Terrace replied without looking up from his food. The reptilian's eyes narrowed. "You won't get far. Man, the drones will see to that. And the biometric scans, they're absolute." Terrace finally met its gaze. "Biometric?" The reptilian bared its teeth in a grin. "Every prisoner's unique signature. It's integrated into the system. Even if you shut down the field, the scanners will pick you up the moment you set foot in the wrong place. No escape. The guards don't even need to chase you. The system does it for them." Terrace leaned back, processing this new information. So, the prison wasn't just relying on the energy fields and guards. There was a deeper layer of security embedded in the very structure. It explained why no one had ever gotten out. They didn't just lock you in, they tagged you, made sure you were never in the wrong place without the system knowing. The reptilian seemed pleased with itself, as if it had just crushed Terrace's hopes. But Terrace only smiled. "Thanks for the tip," he said, standing up and walking away, leaving the alien blinking in confusion. It made sense now. The prison relied on these biometric signatures to track movements, control access to areas, and prevent unauthorized actions. That meant the system was intelligent, adaptive even. But it also meant there had to be a way to trick it. That night, Terrace sat on the edge of his cot, staring at his hands. The guards thought the system was absolute. The prisoners believed it too. But Terrace knew better. Systems, no matter how complex, were made by beings who had limits. And where there were limits, there were flaws. The solution wasn't just to break out of the cell. It was to fool the system into thinking he was never there in the first place. He just needed time. Terrace spent the next few days gathering the last bits of information he needed. He kept to himself, blending into the background as much as possible, but his mind was always working, observing, analyzing, planning. The key wasn't brute force, it was subtlety. Miros detention complex thrived on its assumption that its technology was infallible. That assumption was Terrace's ticket out. His first breakthrough came in the form of a malfunction. One of the prisoners, a hulking, gray-skinned creature, had been injured during a work shift in the industrial sector of the prison. When the guards rushed him back through the corridors, Terrace noticed something. The force fields flickered as the injured prisoner was moved past them. Not just the field in front of the injured alien's cell, but several others along the corridor. That moment was crucial. The prison's biometric scanners were designed to detect prisoners' unique signatures, but it seemed there were scenarios where those systems took a backseat: emergencies, injuries, situations that required rapid response. In those moments, the system was blind, prioritizing speed over security. And that was Terrace's opening. The insectoid alien, who had been watching him since his arrival, clicked nervously from its cell. "You've been staring at that force field for hours. Thinking isn't going to save you." Terrace glanced over. "You're right, but acting will." He stood up and began pacing his cell, formulating the final stages of his plan. The system wasn't invincible. He just had to create the right kind of chaos. The prison operated on two key principles: containment and control. They kept the prisoners locked up and monitored through layers of biometric scanning, energy fields, and physical guards. But they hadn't accounted for how those layers interacted under stress. Terrace had seen enough to understand that, under the right conditions, those layers could be forced to work against each other. The reptilian alien, who had once mocked him, slithered over to the edge of its cell. "You've found something, haven't you? You've got that look, the one they all get before they try to escape and fail." Terrace didn't answer. He didn't need to. He had no intention of failing. The next part of his plan required an ally, someone who could help create the distraction he needed. Terrace had noticed a smaller, wiry alien in a nearby cell, one who seemed out of place in the brutal environment of Miros. It had sharp, calculating eyes, always observing, always taking note of the smallest details. Terrace had watched it work during mealtimes, quietly slipping stolen items between prisoners with such skill that even the guards didn't notice. "Zolan," Terrace said quietly one evening, leaning against the edge of his cell. The wiry alien turned, surprised that the human had addressed him directly. "I need your help." Zolan narrowed his eyes, glancing around before moving closer to the edge of his cell. "What kind of help?" Terrace smirked. "The kind that gets us both out of here." Zolan stared at him for a long moment, then let out a low, skeptical hiss. "You're serious? No one escapes Miros. No one." "I'm not asking you to escape," Terrace said calmly. "I'm asking you to help me create a distraction, one big enough to overload the system. When that happens, I'll take care of the rest." Zolan's eyes flickered with interest, but there was still hesitation. "And why should I trust you? Why should I risk my neck for your plan?" "Because you don't have a choice," Terrace replied simply. "You either stay here and rot, or you help me, and we both walk out of here. It's that simple." There was a long pause before Zolan finally nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "What do you need?" Terrace's plan hinged on triggering a system overload. He'd already learned that the prison's biometric scanners could be temporarily disabled during emergencies, but that alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to force the system into chaos, to make it panic. And that required Zolan's skill in sabotage. "I need you to disable the energy cells in the industrial sector during the next shift," Terrace explained. "Make it look like an accident, something that causes enough of a power surge to shut down the entire grid for a few seconds. It doesn't have to be long, just enough for me to slip past the force fields." Zolan frowned. "That's dangerous. If the surge is too big, they'll notice." "They'll notice either way," Terrace said, "but they won't be able to stop it. The system will go into emergency lockdown, and in those few moments, I'll move. All you have to do is create the opening." Zolan thought it over, his fingers tapping nervously against the edge of his cell. "What happens after that? What's your endgame?" Terrace smiled. "Don't worry about that. Just be ready when the power cuts out." Zolan gave a reluctant nod and slinked back into the shadows of his cell, disappearing from view. Terrace knew he was taking a risk by involving someone else, but he couldn't do it alone. Zolan was sharp, resourceful, and most importantly, desperate enough to follow through. The next day, during the industrial sector shift, Terrace waited. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained calm, unreadable. He trusted Zolan to do his part. It was a delicate operation. One wrong move, and the entire prison would be on high alert. The hours passed slowly, each second feeling like an eternity. And then, without warning, the lights flickered. Terrace's breath caught in his throat as he saw the faintest shimmer in the force field surrounding his cell. It was happening. Suddenly, the entire prison was plunged into darkness. Alarms blared, and the faint hum of the energy fields sputtered and died. The biometric scanners would be scrambling to re-establish control, the guards rushing to secure the prisoners. But in that chaos, Terrace saw his opportunity. He moved quickly, sliding the metal shard he'd been saving into the seam of the force field. With one swift motion, he twisted, and the energy barrier blinked out, leaving him standing in the open. Across the hall, Zolan had done his part. The industrial sector's power cells had overloaded, creating a chain reaction that knocked out the security systems for a few precious seconds. It wasn't long, but it was enough. Terrace slipped out of his cell and into the corridor, keeping low as he made his way toward the nearest exit. He could hear the guards shouting, their voices drowned out by the blaring alarms, but he moved with purpose, his steps quick and silent. The system was still trying to recover, the biometric scanners unable to pinpoint his location amidst the chaos. It was the perfect blind spot, but he wasn't out yet. The real challenge lay ahead. The chaos inside Mihros was absolute. Terrace slipped through the dim corridors, the alarms blaring loud enough to cover his movements. The prison's defenses were down, but not for long. Zolan's sabotage had bought him time, but Terrace knew that the system would eventually re-establish itself. Once that happened, the scanners would be back online, and it would only be a matter of minutes before his escape attempt was detected. He ducked into a side corridor as two guards rushed past, their voices frantic as they called out to each other. "Sector 4's offline," one shouted. "What the hell happened?" "I don't know. Industrial power surge. It knocked out the grids across 3 wings." They disappeared around the corner, leaving Terrace alone again. He continued moving, his mind racing through the next phase of his plan. The guards were distracted, but the system would reset soon. He had to reach the control room before that happened. The control room was buried deep within the heart of the prison, far from the prisoners' cells. Terrace knew the layout from observing the guards' movements over the past weeks. Every patrol, every shift change, it was all part of his strategy. But there was one major obstacle between him and freedom: the core. The core was the brain of Miros Detention Complex. Every force field, every scanner, every defense was controlled from there. It wasn't just a control room. It was a fortress within a fortress, staffed by the most elite guards and reinforced with layers of security that made the rest of the prison look like a playground. And Terrace was going to walk right into it. He made his way through the narrow corridors, avoiding the main paths where guards were most likely to regroup. His footsteps were silent, his movements precise. The biometric scanners were still down, and that gave him a brief window of opportunity. He turned a corner and found himself face to face with a locked security door. Terrace knelt beside it, pulling the small makeshift tool from his boot. The door was sealed with an electronic lock, but he'd studied these systems long enough to know their vulnerabilities. With a few quick motions, he pried off the control panel and exposed the wiring inside. It wasn't a sophisticated hack, but it didn't need to be. A quick cut here, a bypass there, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The hallway ahead led to the core, but it was heavily guarded. There would be no sneaking past this time. Terrace took a deep breath, steeling himself. He had one more trick up his sleeve. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small device, something he'd lifted from one of the guards during a routine inspection weeks ago. It was a jammer, designed to disrupt communications between the guards and the core. It wasn't enough to take down the system, but it would buy him the time he needed. He activated the jammer, then slipped it back into his pocket. The static crackle in his ear told him it was working. The guards wouldn't be able to call for reinforcements, at least for a little while. Terrace moved quickly, approaching the final checkpoint before the core. 2 guards stood at the entrance, their weapons at the ready, but they weren't expecting trouble. They were too focused on the alarms and the chaos elsewhere in the prison. Terrace didn't give them a chance to react. In one swift motion, he lunged forward, grabbing the first guard's arm and twisting it behind his back. The guard yelped in pain, but before he could cry out, Terrace slammed him into the wall, knocking him unconscious. The second guard barely had time to reach for his weapon before Terrace was on him, delivering a sharp blow to the side of his head. The guard crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Terrace dragged their bodies into a nearby maintenance room, then continued toward the core. His heart raced, but his mind remained clear. This was the moment everything had been leading up to. The core was a massive chamber, filled with consoles, screens, and control panels that monitored every inch of the prison. Technicians worked frantically at their stations, trying to bring the system back online after the surge. They hadn't noticed Terrace yet. He moved to the side, slipping between the consoles, his eyes scanning the room. There, at the center, was what he needed, the master control panel. If he could reach it, he could deactivate the remaining security measures, disable the biometric scanners permanently, and open the doors to the outside. But there was a problem. Standing near the master control panel was an alien unlike any Terrace had seen before. It was massive, easily twice his height, with a body covered in thick, armored plates that shimmered in the dim light. Its eyes glowed a dull red, and in its hands was a weapon that hummed with deadly energy. Terrace cursed under his breath. He hadn't accounted for this. The creature was clearly some kind of advanced guard, stationed specifically to protect the core. And it wasn't going to be easy to get past it. The technicians were too busy trying to reset the system to notice Terrace creeping closer. He kept his eyes on the alien guard, watching its movements. It was slow, deliberate, scanning the room for any threats. But it hadn't seen him yet. Terrace reached for the small, round object in his belt, a makeshift explosive he'd crafted from the few materials he could smuggle out of the industrial sector. It wasn't powerful enough to kill the alien, but it would create a distraction. With a flick of his wrist, Terrace tossed the explosive toward the far side of the room. The moment it hit the floor, the explosive detonated with a sharp bang, sending a cloud of smoke and debris into the air. The alien guard reacted immediately, turning toward the source of the explosion and moving to investigate. Terrace seized the moment. He sprinted toward the master control panel, his heart pounding in his chest. The technicians screamed in confusion, ducking for cover as the alien guard barked out orders in its guttural language. Reaching the control panel, Terrace slammed his fist down on the override button. The entire prison shook as the security systems began to shut down. Force fields flickered and died, the biometric scanners went offline, and the automated defenses powered down one by one. The alien guard turned, realizing what was happening. Its red eyes locked onto Terrace, and with a roar of fury, it charged toward him. Terrace didn't hesitate. He grabbed the nearest weapon from a fallen guard, aimed, and fired. The shot wasn't enough to take the alien down, but it slowed it long enough for Terrace to make his next move. He activated the final sequence on the control panel. The massive doors leading out of the core hissed open, revealing the path to freedom. Without looking back, Terrace bolted through the doors, sprinting toward the exit as the alarms blared louder than ever. The alien guard was right behind him, gaining ground with every step. Terrace's lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. The doors were just ahead. Freedom was just ahead. He reached the final door and slammed his hand down on the release. The door opened with a deafening whoosh, and Terrace threw himself through it, rolling to the ground on the other side. The alien guard tried to follow, but the door slammed shut behind him, trapping it inside the core. Terrace lay on the ground for a moment, gasping for breath. He'd done it. He'd made it out. But the fight wasn't over yet. Terrace pushed himself off the cold ground, his body aching from the desperate sprint. The door behind him rattled as the alien guard slammed into it repeatedly, its roars muffled by the thick metal. He had only bought himself moments, not a victory. He still needed to get out, completely out. Ahead, a wide corridor led to the final gate, the last obstacle between him and the vast plains outside Miros detention complex. His legs felt like lead, but there was no time for rest. The alarms continued to wail, and soon the remaining guards would converge on his position. He could almost taste the freedom beyond that gate. Terrace moved quickly, his pace steady but cautious, avoiding the security cameras that were rebooting one by one along the walls. He had made it through the prison's inner sanctum, but the outer perimeter was another challenge entirely. This was where they expected the most hardened attempts to break free, where they had placed their most impenetrable defenses. The corridor led to a series of blast doors that controlled the outer access points. Normally, these doors were operated remotely from the core, but with the system down, he had to manually trigger each one. He reached the first door and slammed the emergency override lever down. Nothing. Terrace cursed under his breath. The system hadn't fully powered back on, meaning the manual controls were still locked out. He needed to find another way around. His eyes scanned the walls, looking for a maintenance hatch, an access tunnel, anything that could bypass the blast doors. Time was running out. His mind raced through the prison layout he had memorized, trying to find a weak point. Then he spotted it. A narrow ventilation shaft high up on the wall, partially concealed behind a stack of crates. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. With a quick glance around to make sure no one was watching, Terrace climbed up the crates and wrenched the vent cover off. He crawled inside the shaft, pulling the cover back into place behind him. The cramped space was barely wide enough to accommodate his body, but it would get him past the blast doors. As he made his way through the narrow passage, the sound of footsteps echoed below. The guards were closing in. They must have realized that he had disabled the core. Terrace quickened his pace, ignoring the claustrophobic squeeze of the shaft walls against his shoulders. He reached the end of the vent, where a small grate offered a view into the final room before the outer gate. This was the last security checkpoint, where the guards' elite forces were stationed to ensure no one made it this far. Terrace could see 3 guards through the slats of the vent, their weapons drawn as they moved into formation. They hadn't seen him yet, but getting past them would be nearly impossible without drawing attention. He needed a distraction. Reaching into his pocket, Terrace pulled out his last remaining explosive. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to divert the guards long enough for him to slip through. He placed the explosive at the far end of the vent and set the timer for a short delay. The explosion was small, but loud enough to send the guards scrambling toward the opposite side of the room, their weapons raised. Terrace took his chance. He kicked out the vent cover and dropped to the floor silently, staying low as the guards rushed to investigate the blast. He moved quickly, ducking behind cover and making his way toward the gate. His fingers flew over the manual controls, bypassing the security locks and initiating the override sequence. The gate began to rise, its gears grinding as it slowly opened. Terrace felt a rush of cold air as the gate lifted, revealing the barren plains beyond. He was almost there. But then, a voice. "Hold it right there!" Terrace spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. One of the guards had spotted him, and his weapon was trained directly on Terrace. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The guard's finger hovered over the trigger, and Terrace knew he wouldn't have time to dodge the shot. No, with a sudden burst of speed, Terrace lunged forward, grabbing the guard's weapon before he could fire. The two of them struggled, their movements frantic as they grappled for control of the gun. The guard was strong, but Terrace was desperate. He couldn't lose now, not when freedom was so close. In one swift motion, Terrace wrenched the weapon from the guard's hands and delivered a hard blow to his jaw, sending him crashing to the ground. He didn't waste any time. The gate was open now, and the other guards were still distracted by the explosion. Terrace sprinted toward the open gate, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pushed his exhausted body to its limits. The cold air hit his face as he crossed the threshold, the alarms fading behind him. He was out. The vast, barren landscape stretched out before him, the prison shrinking into the distance with every step he took. Terrace didn't stop running. His legs ached, his lungs burned, but he didn't stop. He had made it past Miros, past the so-called impenetrable defenses, and into the wide-open world beyond. He had done the impossible. As he finally slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit, Terrace couldn't help but let out a sharp, breathless laugh. The galaxy had thought Miros was the ultimate prison, a place no one could escape from. But to him, it was nothing but a minor obstacle.